Buy now, pay later.
Buy now, pay later firms have boomed over the last 3 years. And companies like PayPal, Apple, and credit cards themselves are joining in on the hype.
Buy now, pay later services. You've probably seen them when you shop online, encouraging you to pay for products in installments rather than all at once.
Buy now, pay later services accounted for $97 billion in e-commerce payments in 2020, and more merchants are hopping on board. A firm reported 102,000 participating merchants thanks to e-commerce company Shopify adding support for the brand.
The buy now, pay later model took ecosystems by a storm, especially after the pandemic. It came as a perfect solution to the rising prices everywhere, making itself a form of debt that's not yet regulated. And this global trend found a great adoption in Egypt. Big time. The gross merchandise value is forecasted to exceed $6 billion in 2028 from only $1.7 billion in 2023 in Egypt. However, there are real concerns about BNPL everywhere, as it encourages unsustainable spending and can put the consumers at the risk of debt.
Buy now, pay later services, or BNPL for short, have exploded in popularity over the last few years, especially among millennial and Gen Z consumers. And that has some analysts concerned.
It looks pretty innocuous, on the surface, like, what harm could this really do? But using it repetitively and in close proximity could really create a downward spiral for debt.
The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has requested information from some of the largest BNPL providers in the U.S. as part of an inquiry it opened into the industry in December of 2021.
A third of BNPL users reported falling behind on at least one payment. BNPL can also make it easier to buy things you can't necessarily afford. 57% of users said they regretted their purchase because the item was too expensive. At the end of the day, a BNPL purchase is still debt.
And these concerns were also voiced in Egypt, as the rising costs have been a boom for BNPL. The recent state regulations and economic reforms have boosted a fast growth of the sector since the second quarter of 2020, which created many adoption practices of BNPL, like Amazon Egypt announcing that it will begin offering BNPL services to approved buyers through the fintech startup Value. Then, the inflation and more rise in prices have prompted more growth in consumer finance and other non-banking financial services like BNPL, as stated by the CEO of BTech. However, Professor Mahmoud Al-Said, Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at Cairo University, points out that, despite their benefits, these companies may lead consumers to spend more than they can afford to repay, which could in turn lead to default in the future, and increase in the number of people in debt beyond the ability of the society. These conditions can be seen as mirroring a perfect consumer economy cycle, in which the fintech startups offering BNPL lending services are basically allowing citizens to have access to more than what they can currently afford. And with the increased purchasing power, consumers buy more and e-commerce platforms' revenues grow. And of course, the more goods are sold online, the more delivery services are required. And this whole cycle is boosted by the financial inclusion policies and the increased internet connectivity. And you can call these dynamics consumerism on steroids. So it really comes at no surprise that the most funded startups during the past 2 years were actually in these three sectors: fintech, e-commerce, and transport and logistics, as they actually boost each other in any consumer society. However, the signs of downturn coming in quickly in 2022 were showing a reverse in direction, as startups globally were being urged to cut spending.
Inflation is much too high, and we understand the hardship it is causing, and we're moving expeditiously to bring it back down.
With inflation hovering around its highest rate in 40 years, the Federal Reserve is expected to raise interest rates several times in 2022. You can see on this chart that the rate was lowered to nearly 0% in 2020 to boost the economy at the beginning of the pandemic.
We've raised the federal funds rate by 500 basis points since a little more than a year ago. We also think that there's more tightening power coming through.
The speed of this hiking cycle is distorting Wall Street and reshaping personal finance in America.
We are in a different environment than what we've experienced over the past 15 years.
In August 22, the Financial Times have predicted a silent crash in VC funding and alarmed that the party is over. Those who witnessed the historic boom in funding in 21 have walked into a new reality where the world has changed drastically, and the uncertainty about when capital will be freely available again has fostered an inevitable caution.
We are currently experiencing a central banker's vibe of higher for longer. You're to some extent limiting non-productive investments that would not necessarily generate revenue in this high interest rate environment. It's very different in a low interest rate environment where money is free, and essentially any type of investment is really worth it because the cost of capital is close to zero.
The economy grew steadily through the 2010s as more cash went into risky investments. Startups disrupted the transportation, housing, and tech industries, but some companies can't handle today's higher interest rates. In the first half of 2023, there have been 41 corporate defaults in the US, the most of any region globally.
And those were the ones who couldn't survive. However, others immediately adapted by laying off thousands of employees.
The tech sector shed more than 386,000 jobs in 2022 and the first half of 2023, and that number is climbing.
Google today joined a growing list of tech giants scaling back, adding to the tens of thousands of workers in the industry who find themselves unemployed.
They grew too quickly during the pandemic. There was this glut of spending on tech products when the pandemic first hit and people were stuck at home and businesses had to find ways to help their employees work from home. So that means buying a lot of computers, buying a lot of IT services, Zoom subscriptions, you name it. That all caused a lot of money to be injected into the tech industry. And some people in the tech industry, some executives, got a little overconfident thinking this growth is going to be sustained forever. Let's hire now and get ready for that growth. But they overprojected it. And now we're seeing an economic slowdown and everything's coming home to roost.
Nothing can describe these new harsh conditions better than the loss of 85% of Klarna's valuation, the once second most valuable fintech startup in the world offering BNPL service. It was just because investors are suddenly voting in the opposite manner to the way they voted for in the past few years.
Companies like Affirm and Klarna got a ton of attention, really high valuations. During COVID especially, there was a view that this was going to change banking completely, but the valuations that they were getting end up not being justifiable when you look at the revenue they're bringing in.
The darn thing has lost 85% of its value. And Klarna is just the latest disappointment of many in the buy now, pay later universe, as well as the broader lending technology space. These stocks were red hot a year ago, yet now they're one of the weakest areas of the market.
And in this new high interest rate environment, the global VC funding was primed for a reset in 23, dropping by nearly 50% in the first half of the year in the once booming fintech sector, the darling sector to VCs. And it was about the same ratio for all funding.
Venture funding felt the pain in the first quarter, according to new data from Crunchbase. And despite a couple of massive deals, global VC funding fell 53% as investors continue to hold on to their dry powder. Allie, what are the details on this funding drought?
Yeah, the headline looks bad, Jared. It does. And that's because it is bad. And if you dive deeper into the data also looks roughly as bad.
Well, the data for Egypt was also bad, as funding for startups was drying up. The published news from Magnet on their X account was signaling an average of 45% drop in funding for MENA region, especially in fintech, comparing Q3 of 23 to Q3 of 22. However, if we look deeply in Egypt, the funding reported by Magnet till Q3 was only $335 million, which means that excluding the $260 million VC funding of Halan this year, the whole ecosystem of startups had a drop of 80% in funding as compared to Q3 in 22, sharing only $75 million. And that's how the bad news was for Egypt. With all these challenging conditions globally and in Egypt, no one was prepared for another shockwave of an extinction level event like the coming one.
The collapse of Silicon Valley Bank is causing shockwaves across the entire business world.